Sometimes the law knocks on a door, and sometimes it kicks the wrong one. The quiet Baltimore street had been settling into the calm rhythm of evening, the kind of calm that wraps around a neighborhood like a blanket after a long day. Porch lights glowed softly. Sprinklers ticked across trimmed lawns. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. On Maplewood Avenue, most houses had already dimmed their lights for the night, but number 417 still glowed warmly from the inside. Inside that modest brick home lived Eleanor Brooks, 72 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, with silver hair and the steady hands of someone who had spent 40 years writing careful notes on chalkboards for generations of students. Eleanor moved slowly these days, but there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Earlier that evening she had watered the small rose garden near her front steps, the same roses her late husband planted decades ago. To anyone passing by, the house looked like it belonged to someone's grandmother, the kind who baked pies on Sundays and waved to neighbors walking their dogs. And that was exactly who Eleanor Brooks was. What no one could see from the outside was that this house also held a lifetime of stories, memories, and lessons about fairness, dignity, and patience. Lessons she had taught hundreds of children in Baltimore public schools. Lessons she believed in with her whole heart. That quiet evening should have ended like every other one. A cup of tea, a soft lamp in the living room, the gentle hum of the old ceiling fan. Instead, the calm cracked open with the sharp glow of flashing red and blue lights turning slowly around the corner. A patrol car rolled down Maplewood Avenue at a deliberate crawl, its headlights sliding across lawns and mailboxes like a searching spotlight. Brooks stood adjusting the watering hose near the steps. She hadn't noticed the cruiser yet. The roses needed just a little more water before the temperature dropped overnight. Hayes watched for a moment through the windshield. In his mind, the quiet scene in front of him began forming its own story. Assumptions came quickly, faster than facts. He pulled the cruiser to the curb with a sudden stop. The tires crunched softly against the gravel edge of the road. The flashing lights continued spinning, painting the brick house in waves of red and blue. Eleanor finally turned, startled by the sudden brightness. For a moment, she simply blinked into the lights, unsure why a police car had stopped in front of her home. The cruiser door opened. Officer Hayes stepped out with heavy boots striking the pavement. The calm neighborhood watched through curtains and half-open doors as the officer walked toward the small front gate. His voice carried across the quiet street, sharp and impatient. "Ma'am, step away from the house." Eleanor straightened slowly, confused by the command but polite enough to listen. "Officer, is something wrong?" she asked gently. Hayes didn't answer the question. His eyes scanned the porch, the windows, the quiet yard. Then they settled back on her. Suspicion had already made up its mind. "We're looking for someone," he said shortly. "And this house fits the description." Eleanor glanced back at the peaceful home behind her, then at the officer standing on the walkway like a storm that had wandered onto the wrong street. Glistened under the red and blue glow, each petal catching the light like tiny mirrors. For a moment the entire block seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor kept both hands visible at her sides, her posture calm, the same calm she had used for decades when guiding restless classrooms full of children. "Officer," she said again, her voice steady and polite, "I do not understand what is happening." Hayes stepped closer to the porch, his boots heavy against the concrete path. His eyes moved from the windows of the house to the dim shapes of neighboring homes where curtains had begun to shift. People were watching. They always watched when patrol lights appeared. The officer lifted a hand slightly, as if signaling her to stay exactly where she was. "We received a call about someone running through this area," he said, his tone firm and impatient. "And your house is right where the report placed them." Eleanor glanced down the quiet street, then back at him. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did at this hour. A street lamp flickered near the corner. A parked sedan sat quietly beneath a maple tree. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. "Young man," she replied gently, "I have been out here watering my roses for nearly 10 minutes. I have not seen anyone running anywhere." Hayes narrowed his eyes slightly, not satisfied with the answer. Suspicion, once planted in the mind, has a strange way of growing roots. He stepped onto the first porch step, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight. The distance between them shortened to only a few feet. Eleanor could now see the badge clipped to his uniform catching the reflection of the patrol lights. Do you live here alone? He asked. Yes, she answered calmly. Deliberate, the way someone moves when they do not wish to cause misunderstanding. Officer Hayes, she said softly after reading the name stitched onto his uniform. May I ask why you believe someone is inside my home? The question hung in the air between them. Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the cruiser, as if confirming that the flashing lights still commanded the street. Several houses down, a porch door quietly opened, and a neighbor leaned out just far enough to see what was happening. The officer noticed and straightened his posture slightly. Authority tends to grow louder when witnesses appear. Because someone had to run somewhere, Hayes replied finally. And this is the closest place they could have gone. Eleanor looked toward the closed front door of her home and then back at him. Her voice remained calm, but carried a quiet certainty. Officer, I locked that door before I stepped outside. No one has entered my home tonight. Hayes studied her face for a moment, searching for something that might confirm the story he had already built in his mind. Felt colder now, heavier somehow, as if the evening itself had shifted. Hayes had expected hesitation, maybe even fear. What he had not expected was calm refusal delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly where the line stood. Eleanor rested one hand lightly against the porch railing, her posture relaxed but steady. She had spent most of her life teaching young people that respect and patience could calm almost any situation. But she had also taught them something else. That dignity was not something you surrendered simply because someone demanded it. Hayes tilted his head slightly, studying her again as if seeing her differently now. The silver hair, the small frame, the simple cardigan draped over her shoulders. Nothing about her looked threatening. Nothing about the quiet home behind her suggested trouble. And yet something in her calm answer seemed to irritate him more than open defiance ever could. Ma'am, he said slowly, the firmness in his voice sharpening just a little. This is an active situation. If someone ran through here, they had to go somewhere. I am not asking again. Eleanor listened carefully to the words. She had heard tones like that before. Not from police officers, but from impatient students, frustrated parents, and administrators who believed authority alone solved problems. Windows of the house, as if expecting movement behind the curtains. There was none. The living room lamp glowed faintly through the glass, revealing nothing but the quiet outline of furniture inside. Finally, he stepped down from the porch and walked slowly along the short path toward the front gate, scanning the yard again as though searching for signs of someone hiding. Eleanor watched him with the patience of someone who had seen many misunderstandings unfold and resolve over time. But as Hayes reached the gate, something else caught his attention. Across the street, a neighbor had stepped onto his porch with a phone held loosely at chest level, its camera pointed in their direction. The small glowing screen reflected the flashing patrol lights. Hayes stopped walking. His eyes flicked from the phone to Eleanor and back again. The presence of witnesses changes the atmosphere of any encounter. Voices grow firmer. Decisions grow quicker. He turned back toward the porch and walked up the path again, this time with a more deliberate stride. Eleanor remained exactly where she stood, hands folded lightly in front of her, waiting. Ma'am, Hayes said again, this time louder. I need you to cooperate so that we can clear this situation. Eleanor looked at him steadily, the same calm gaze she had used for decades when explaining complicated lessons to students who believed the answer was simpler than it really was. Officer, she replied, I am cooperating. I am standing here speaking with you. Hayes exhaled slowly through his nose. For the first time since stepping out of the cruiser, the situation felt less predictable, less controlled. And sometimes when control begins to slip, people respond by trying to take it back more forcefully. He gestured briefly toward the door behind her. Then open the house so we can settle this right now. Eleanor glanced once at the door, then back at him. The porch light reflected in her calm eyes. That door has been closed all evening, she said quietly, and it will remain closed until there is a lawful reason to open it. Hayes stared at her again, the silence stretching across the small porch like a tightening rope. Because in that moment Officer Daniel Hayes was no longer thinking about a vague report on the police radio. He was thinking about the fact that the quiet, elderly woman in front of him was not reacting the way he expected. And sometimes the moment people realize they cannot control a situation is the exact moment everything begins to escalate. Officer Daniel Hayes stood at the bottom step of the porch again, staring at Eleanor Brooks as the quiet street around them continued to glow under the slow rotation of red and blue lights. The moment had stretched longer than he expected. What should have been a simple check had turned into something stubborn and immovable. Eleanor remained exactly where she had been, hands loosely folded, shoulders relaxed, her calm presence filling the porch with a quiet dignity that refused to be rushed. Hayes glanced once more toward the cruiser parked at the curb. The radio inside crackled faintly, but no new message came through. No backup vehicle arrived. The entire street had become a small stage illuminated by flashing lights and the watchful eyes of neighbors peering through windows and half-open doors. Hayes stepped forward again onto the porch, his voice sharper now as impatience began to edge into his tone. "Ma'am, I told you already. This will go faster if you simply cooperate." Eleanor looked at him with the same composed expression she had carried since the beginning of the encounter. Years of teaching had trained her to recognize the difference between authority used with care and authority used with frustration. She answered in the same steady voice she would have used in a classroom when a student raised their voice for the wrong reason. "Officer Hayes, I have been cooperating from the moment you arrived. I have answered every question you asked." Hayes gestured briefly toward the door behind her, then opened the door. Eleanor shook her head once, slow and deliberate. "Respectfully, officer, that is not something I can do without a lawful reason." The porch light hummed softly above them. The wind chime near the door stirred again, producing a faint metallic note that seemed almost out of place in the tension building between them. Hayes exhaled through his nose and ran a hand across the back of his neck as if trying to shake off the irritation creeping into the moment. He glanced across the street again. The neighbor with the phone had not moved. The small glowing screen remained pointed toward the porch. Another porch light down the block flicked on, revealing two silhouettes standing quietly near a railing. The entire neighborhood was awake now. Hayes returned his attention to Eleanor. "You said you live here alone," he said. Eleanor nodded calmly. "That is correct." "Then there is no one else inside?" he asked. "No one," she replied. Hayes looked toward the door again, then toward the windows, as though expecting movement behind the curtains. The living room lamp still glowed quietly through the glass, unchanged, revealing nothing but the still outline of a sofa and a small side table. For a moment he said nothing. The silence deepened, thick with the feeling that the situation had reached a point where something had to give. Finally Hayes spoke again, his voice firmer than before. "Ma'am, I have reason to believe someone entered this house." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her calm eyes studying him with the same patient curiosity she once used when a student insisted an incorrect answer was right. "And what reason would that be?" she asked softly. Hayes hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the question to hang in the air. Then he answered with the confidence of someone determined not to appear uncertain. "Because it is the closest house on the block." Eleanor allowed a small pause before responding. The kind of pause that comes from someone carefully choosing words that will not inflame the moment. "Officer Hayes," she said quietly, "being the closest house does not make it the right house." Hayes stared at her again, his expression tightening slightly, composed, but carrying a quiet gravity that had not been there before. "The people who live in this house," she said slowly, "take the law very seriously." Hayes let out a short breath, almost a dismissive sound, as though the statement meant very little to him. He lowered his hand from the door and turned fully toward her again. "Ma'am," he replied, "right now the only law that matters is the one I am enforcing on this street tonight." Eleanor watched him carefully. The porch light reflected in her eyes again, steady and unshaken. Because what Officer Daniel Hayes did not realize in that moment was that the law he believed he controlled was about to step onto that street in a way he never expected. Officer Daniel Hayes held Eleanor Brooks's gaze for a moment after her words settled into the quiet air of the porch. The flashing patrol lights continued their slow rhythm behind him, turning the quiet street into a strange theater of color and shadow. Hayes let out a short breath through his nose as if brushing away her warning like dust. In his mind the situation remained simple. A suspicious circumstance. A house at the end of the block. An uncooperative resident. The kind of moment he believed he had handled dozens of times before. "Ma'am," he said with a controlled firmness. "Everyone takes the law seriously when there is a problem. That is why I am here." Eleanor Brooks did not react to the tone. She had seen impatience before. She had seen authority used like a hammer instead of a tool. Her voice remained gentle but steady. And that is exactly why I am asking you to be careful with it. Hayes shook his head slightly, as if the conversation had drifted too far from where he wanted it to go. He stepped away from the door and walked down the porch steps again, scanning the front yard and the quiet sidewalk beyond the small gate. The street remained still except for the movement of neighbors watching from a distance. A man across the street still held his phone up, the small glowing screen reflecting the spinning patrol lights. Another porch light farther down Maplewood Avenue had turned on, revealing a couple standing quietly beside a railing. Hayes noticed the attention and straightened his shoulders slightly. Situations like this always look different once. People started watching. He walked back toward the cruiser for a moment and rested one hand on the roof of the car, thinking. The radio inside the vehicle murmured faintly with routine dispatch chatter. Nothing urgent. Nothing related to the call that had brought him here. For a brief moment Hayes considered simply finishing the check and moving on. But the quiet refusal he had received on the porch still lingered in his mind. It felt like resistance. And resistance had a way of making officers push harder. He stepped away from the cruiser again and walked back toward the house with renewed determination. Eleanor Brooks had not moved. She still stood beside the porch railing with the same calm posture, her silver hair catching the porch light in soft strands. The roses beside the steps glistened faintly with the water she had given them earlier, their scent faint but present in the cool evening air. Hayes stopped at the bottom step and looked up at her again. "Let us try this again," he said, his voice louder now so that anyone listening across the street could hear clearly. "If there is nothing to hide inside that house, then opening the door solves everything." Eleanor studied him quietly for a moment before answering. Her voice remained calm, but there was a deeper weight in it now, the kind that comes when someone realizes the conversation has reached an important line. "Officer Hayes, nothing inside that house is hiding from you. But that does not change the rules that protect it." Hayes crossed his arms briefly, his expression tightening as the quiet refusal repeated itself once more. "Rules also allow officers to investigate when something looks suspicious," he replied. Eleanor nodded gently. "That is true. But investigation does not begin by ignoring the rights of the people who live here." The porch light hummed softly above them again. Somewhere down the block a car door closed, and the sound echoed faintly through the still neighborhood. Hayes looked toward the door one more time, then back at Eleanor. His patience had clearly thinned. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you are making this situation more complicated than it needs to be." Eleanor shook her head slightly, her expression calm but unwavering. "No, officer. I am reminding you that complicated situations become simple when everyone follows the law." Hayes stared at her for several seconds, the silence stretching again. Then he spoke with a trace of skepticism in his voice. "You speak about the law like you know it very well." Eleanor allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch her face. Not amusement, not arrogance, just quiet confidence. "After many years in this country," she replied softly, "most people learn at least a little about the rights that protect them." Hayes shifted his stance again, clearly unconvinced. "Well, tonight," he said, "those rights are not the issue. I just need to confirm that no one ran into your house." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if considering the statement. Then she spoke again, her voice steady but carrying a quiet seriousness that seemed to slow the moment around them. "Officer Hayes, you are standing in front of a home that has always respected the law." She paused briefly before continuing. "And the reason for that respect is very simple." Hayes raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what reason would that be?" Eleanor looked toward the quiet street, then back at him, her eyes reflecting the steady porch light. "Because my son has dedicated his entire life to it." Hayes gave a faint shrug, unimpressed by the statement. "A lot of people say that about their children," he replied. Eleanor nodded slowly, accepting the remark without offense. "Yes," she said gently, "but not many of them can say their son works for the United States Department of Justice." The words hung in the air between them, calm and quiet. Hayes blinked once, clearly unsure whether the statement meant anything at all. From his perspective, it sounded like little more than a proud mother speaking about a successful career. He tilted his head slightly and gave a short dismissive breath. "That is very nice, ma'am," he said. Eleanor did not move. Her calm voice returned once more, steady and unshaken. "His name is Marcus Brooks," she said quietly. and he takes the law very seriously. Hayes stared at her for another moment before glancing briefly back toward the cruiser lights reflecting across the street. What he still did not realize was that somewhere miles away, a man named Marcus Brooks had already received a phone call that would soon send him driving straight toward Maplewood Avenue. Officer Daniel Hayes held Eleanor Brooks's gaze for a moment after her words settled into the quiet air of the porch. The flashing patrol lights continued their slow rhythm behind him, turning the quiet street into a strange theater of color and shadow. Hayes let out a short breath through his nose as if brushing away her warning like dust. In his mind, the situation remained simple. A suspicious circumstance. A house at the end of the block. An uncooperative resident. The kind of moment he believed he had handled dozens of times before. "Ma'am," he said with a controlled firmness. "Everyone takes the law seriously when there is a problem. That is why I am here." Eleanor Brooks did not react to the tone. She had seen impatience before. She had seen authority used like a hammer instead of a tool. Her voice remained gentle but steady. "And that is exactly why I am asking you to be careful with it." Hayes shook his head slightly, as if the conversation had drifted too far from where he wanted it to go. He stepped away from the door and walked down the porch steps again, scanning the front yard and the quiet sidewalk beyond the small gate. The street remained still except for the movement of neighbors watching from a distance. A man across the street still held his phone up, the small glowing screen reflecting the spinning patrol lights. Another porch light farther down Maplewood Avenue had turned on, revealing a couple standing quietly beside a railing. Hayes noticed the attention and straightened his shoulders slightly. Situations like this always looked different once people started watching. He walked back toward the cruiser for a moment and rested one hand on the roof of the car, thinking. The radio inside the vehicle murmured faintly with routine dispatch chatter. Nothing urgent. Nothing related to the call that had brought him here. For a brief moment Hayes considered simply finishing the check and moving on. But the quiet refusal he had received on the porch still lingered in his mind. It felt like resistance. And resistance had a way of making officers push harder. He stepped away from the cruiser again and walked back toward the house with renewed determination. Eleanor Brooks had not moved. She still stood beside the porch railing with the same calm posture, her silver hair catching the porch light in soft strands, their scent faint but present in the cool evening air. Hayes stopped at the bottom step and looked up at her again. "Let us try this again," he said, his voice louder now so that anyone listening across the street could hear clearly. "If there is nothing to hide inside that house, then opening the door solves everything." Eleanor studied him quietly for a moment before answering. Her voice remained calm, but there was a deeper weight in it now, the kind that comes when someone realizes the conversation has reached an important line. "Officer Hayes, nothing inside that house is hiding from you. But that does not change the rules that protect it." Hayes crossed his arms briefly, his expression tightening as the quiet refusal repeated itself once more. "Rules also allow officers to investigate when something looks suspicious," he replied. Eleanor nodded gently. "That is true. But investigation does not begin by ignoring the rights of the people who live here." The porch light hummed softly above them again. Somewhere down the block a car door closed, and the sound echoed faintly through the still neighborhood. Hayes looked toward the door one more time, then back at Eleanor. His patience had clearly thinned. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you are making this situation more complicated than it needs to be." Eleanor shook her head slightly, her expression calm but unwavering. "No, officer. I am reminding you that complicated situations become simple when everyone follows the law." Hayes stared at her for several seconds, the silence stretching again. Then he spoke with a trace of skepticism in his voice. "You speak about the law like you know it very well." Eleanor allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch her face. Not amusement. Continuing. "And the reason for that respect is very simple." Hayes raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what reason would that be?" Eleanor looked toward the quiet street, then back at him, her eyes reflecting the steady porch light. "Because my son has dedicated his entire life to it." Hayes gave a faint shrug, unimpressed by the statement. "A lot of people say that about their children," he replied. Eleanor nodded slowly, accepting the remark without offense. "Yes," she said gently, "but not many of them can say their son works for the United States Department of Justice." The words hung in the air between them, calm and quiet. Hayes blinked once, clearly unsure whether the statement meant anything at all. From his perspective, it sounded like little more than a proud mother speaking about a successful career. He tilted his head slightly and gave a short, dismissive breath. "That is very nice, ma'am," he said. Eleanor did not move. Her calm voice returned once more, steady and unshaken. "His name is Marcus Brooks," she said quietly, "and he takes the law very seriously." Hayes stared at her for another moment before glancing briefly back toward the cruiser lights reflecting across the street. What he still did not realize was that somewhere miles away, a man named Marcus Brooks had already received a phone call that would soon send him driving straight toward Maplewood Avenue. Officer Daniel Hayes stood in the glow of the rotating patrol lights, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the comm statement that had just come from Eleanor Brooks. The quiet street seemed to pause again, as if even the night air had leaned closer to hear the name she had spoken. Glow across the wooden boards and the brass handle of the door behind her. Her voice remained composed when she spoke again. "Officer Hayes, I am not telling you this to impress you." Hayes folded his arms loosely across his chest. "Then why mention it at all?" Eleanor's gaze remained steady, the calm of someone who had spent decades explaining important things to people who were not yet ready to listen. "Because sometimes it is wise to know who you are speaking with before deciding how far to push a situation." Hayes exhaled through his nose again, clearly unimpressed by the warning. In his mind, the situation had already been decided. He was the officer responding to a call. She was a resident refusing a request. The balance of authority seemed obvious to him. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice firm again. "Right now the only thing that matters is confirming that no one entered this house." Eleanor nodded slightly. "And I have told you already that no one did." Hayes glanced toward the front windows again, as if the quiet interior might suddenly reveal something new. The warm glow of the living room lamp remained unchanged, casting soft shadows across the curtains. Nothing moved inside. Nothing suggested the presence of anyone else. Still, Hayes seemed unwilling to release the assumption he had built in his mind. He stepped closer to the porch again, stopping just short of the first step. "You said your son works for the Department of Justice," he said, his tone carrying a hint of skepticism now. "What exactly does that mean?" Eleanor rested one hand gently on the porch railing as the breeze stirred the wind chime beside the door again. The small metallic sound echoed softly into the quiet street. "It means," she answered calmly, "that he has spent many years making sure the law is followed the way it is written." Hayes raised one eyebrow slightly. "That could mean a lot of things." Eleanor gave a small nod. "Yes, it could." The officer studied her again, perhaps expecting her confidence to fade under his scrutiny. It did not. Her calm expression remained unchanged, carried a quiet certainty that seemed to slow the air around them. "He may not be standing here yet." Hayes frowned slightly at the last word. "Yet." Before he could ask what she meant, Eleanor reached slowly into the pocket of her cardigan and removed a small phone. She held it carefully in her hand, her movements unhurried and transparent, so there could be no misunderstanding. Hayes immediately straightened, watching the phone with alert eyes. "Ma'am," he said sharply, "what are you doing?" Eleanor looked at the screen for a moment, then raised her calm eyes back to him. "I am letting my son know that there is a police officer on my porch who seems very determined to enter my home." Hayes gave a short, dismissive breath again. "You can call anyone you want." Eleanor nodded gently as her thumb moved across the screen. The quiet tap of her finger against the glass sounded surprisingly loud in the stillness of the street. Across the road, the neighbor holding the phone shifted slightly to keep both of them in frame. The patrol lights continued to turn slowly, washing the porch in alternating colors. Hayes stood with his hands resting on his belt now, watching her with an expression that suggested mild annoyance rather than concern. In his mind, the phone call was nothing more than a small delay. A proud mother calling her son for reassurance. Nothing that would change the authority of the moment. Eleanor lifted the phone to her ear and waited. The call rang once, then twice. The quiet ringing seemed to echo through the night air like a distant bell. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. Eleanor's expression softened slightly as she spoke. "Marcus," she said gently, "I am sorry to bother you this evening." Hayes shifted his weight again, glancing briefly toward the cruiser before returning his attention to her conversation. Eleanor listened for a moment, then continued speaking in the same calm voice. "There is an officer here who believes someone entered my home. I have tried to explain that nothing like that has happened." Hayes could not hear the voice on the other end of the phone, but he could see Eleanor's expression change just slightly as she listened to the response. She nodded once. Yes, she said softly. Maplewood Avenue. Another pause. Then her voice returned again. Number 417. Hayes watched the exchange with growing impatience. To him, the call still seemed like a simple family conversation. He had no way of knowing that the man on the other end of that line had already stood up from his desk the moment he heard the concern in his mother's voice. And miles away, Marcus Brooks was already reaching for his car keys. The quiet ring of the phone call ended and Eleanor Brooks slowly lowered the device from her ear. The porch light continued to glow softly above her, and the red and blue reflection from the patrol car swept across the quiet street like a slow-turning tide. Officer Daniel Hayes watched her with a faint look of impatience, his hands resting on his duty belt as though the moment had become nothing more than a minor delay in his evening patrol. Eleanor placed the phone gently back into the pocket of her cardigan and returned her calm gaze to the officer. Across the street, the neighbor with the phone had not moved. The small glowing screen still captured every second of the encounter. Hayes tilted his head slightly. Well? He asked with a short breath that carried more irritation than curiosity. Eleanor's voice remained soft and steady when she answered. My son is on his way. Hayes gave a quiet chuckle that did not carry any warmth. Ma'am, I do not think that is necessary. Eleanor folded her hands loosely again in front of her. Perhaps not, she replied calmly, but he insisted. Hayes glanced toward the cruiser again as the radio inside crackled briefly before falling silent. Nothing about the quiet neighborhood suggested urgency. Yet something in Eleanor's confidence lingered in the air like a small, unanswered question. Hayes shook it off and stepped down from the porch again, pacing slowly toward the gate, as if giving the situation a final moment to resolve itself. The wind moved gently through the maple tree near the sidewalk, causing the leaves to rustle faintly above the parked patrol car. A few more neighbors had quietly stepped onto their porches now, drawn by the unusual glow of the lights. Hayes noticed them, but pretended not to care. He turned back toward Eleanor again. Your son may be a very busy man, he said, but I still have a job to finish tonight. Eleanor nodded gently. I understand that. Hayes gestured toward the door again, repeating the request that had hung over the entire encounter. Then open the house, and we can settle this before he arrives. Eleanor shook her head slowly, the same patient refusal that had remained unchanged from the beginning. Officer Hayes, I have already explained why that cannot happen. Hayes looked toward the door once more, clearly frustrated that the situation had not moved in the direction he expected. The porch light reflected in the polished brass handle like a small quiet star. Everything about the house suggested calm order. Everything except the tension that now lingered between the officer and the woman standing on the porch. Minutes passed slowly. The patrol lights continued to rotate. The neighbor across the street shifted slightly, adjusting the angle of the phone in his hand. Then, from the far end of Maplewood Avenue, the low sound of an approaching engine broke the stillness of the street. At first it was distant, just the hum of a vehicle moving through the quiet neighborhood. Hayes turned his head slightly toward the sound, but did not react. Cars passed through residential streets all the time. The headlights appeared at the end of the block a few seconds later, bright beams sliding across the pavement and the parked vehicles along the curb. The approaching vehicle was a dark sedan, moving steadily but without hurry. Eleanor noticed it first. Her calm expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in the way she straightened her shoulders. Hayes noticed the movement and glanced toward the headlights again. The sedan slowed as it turned onto Maplewood Avenue and continued down the block toward the flashing patrol car. The vehicle came to a smooth stop about 20 feet behind the cruiser. For a moment, the engine remained running. Hayes watched with mild curiosity now. The driver's door opened slowly. A tall man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit that caught the glow of the patrol lights as he closed the car door behind him. The man paused for a moment beside the vehicle, taking in the scene in front of him. The flashing cruiser, the quiet houses, the small crowd of watching neighbors, and finally the porch where his mother stood under the warm porch light. Marcus Brooks began walking toward the house with calm, deliberate steps. Hayes studied him carefully now, noticing the confident posture, the measured pace, and the sharp focus in the man's eyes as he approached. Marcus reached the sidewalk and continued forward until he stood beside the small front gate. He looked first at his mother, his expression softening slightly when he saw that she was unharmed. Then his attention shifted to Officer Hayes. For a brief second, the entire street seemed to fall completely silent. Marcus opened the gate and stepped onto the walkway leading toward the porch. Hayes straightened his posture automatically, sensing that the quiet encounter he had expected to control might no longer belong entirely to him. Marcus stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the officer with calm, steady eyes. His voice was measured when he finally spoke. "Good evening, officer." Hayes nodded once in return. "And you are?" Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small leather case. He opened it carefully so the badge and identification inside could be seen clearly in the porch light. The quiet authority in his voice carried across the silent street. "Marcus Brooks," he said, "United States Attorney." Officer Daniel Hayes stared at the open identification for a moment longer than he intended to. The leather badge case caught the porch light, reflecting a steady glow across the gold seal and the crisp federal credentials beneath it. For the first time since stepping onto Maplewood Avenue that evening, the certainty in his posture shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that the change could be felt in the quiet air between them. Marcus Brooks closed the badge case slowly and returned it to the inside pocket of his jacket. His movements were calm, deliberate, and controlled, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has spent years standing inside courtrooms where every word carries weight. He stepped up one more step toward the porch, stopping beside his mother. For a brief second, he turned to Eleanor. His voice softened. "Mom, are you all right?" Eleanor Brooks nodded gently, the same calm dignity she had carried all evening still present in her expression. "I am fine, Marcus." The officer was simply asking questions. Marcus studied her face carefully, as if confirming for himself that she truly meant those words. Satisfied, he turned his attention back to Officer Hayes. The flashing patrol lights washed across the three of them in slow pulses of red and blue. Hayes cleared his throat slightly, the first sign that the balance of the situation had changed in a way he had not expected. "Sir," he said, his tone noticeably more measured now, "we received a report about someone running through this area. I was just conducting a check." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the explanation without argument. "And you believe that person entered this house?" Hayes hesitated for a brief moment before answering. It was the closest house on the block. Marcus let that answer settle into the quiet street. The neighbors watching from their porches did not move. The phone across the street still captured every second of the encounter. Marcus looked toward the front door of the house, then back to Hayes again. "Did you observe anyone enter the home?" Hayes shifted his stance slightly. "No. Did you see any sign that someone had forced entry?" Marcus asked calmly. "No," Hayes admitted again. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if placing each answer into a quiet mental record. "And my mother informed you that no one had entered the house?" Hayes gave a small nod. "She did." Marcus folded his hands loosely in front of him, his posture relaxed but precise. "Then help me understand something, officer." Hayes waited. Marcus's voice remained calm, but carried the steady rhythm of someone who was used to asking questions that mattered. "If you had no witness, no evidence, and no sign of entry, what legal basis did you have to insist on entering this home?" Hayes opened his mouth slightly as if preparing an answer, but the words did not come immediately. The quiet street seemed to lean closer again. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply waited. Finally, Hayes responded, though the confidence in his voice had softened. "I was trying to clear the situation." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand that officers must investigate situations. That is part of maintaining public safety." Hayes seemed relieved by the acknowledgement, but Marcus continued speaking before the officer could respond. "But investigation must always remain within the boundaries of the law." Hayes did not answer this time. Marcus glanced briefly toward the neighbor across the street, who still held the phone pointed at the porch. The small glowing screen reflected the rotating lights of the patrol car like a silent witness to the conversation. "Marcus, look back at Hayes. My mother has lived in this house for more than 40 years, he said calmly. She is a retired schoolteacher who has spent her entire life contributing to this community. Eleanor looked down slightly, almost embarrassed by the attention, but Marcus continued. She also understands her rights under the law. and she exercised those rights tonight with remarkable patience. Hayes remained still, listening. Marcus's voice remained steady. The law protects every citizen equally. That includes the right to feel safe inside your own home. Hayes nodded once, slowly. Yes, sir. Marcus studied him for another moment, not with anger, but with the quiet seriousness of someone who believed deeply in the system he represented. Then I believe the situation is already clear, Marcus said. Hayes glanced toward the door of the house once more, then back at Marcus and Eleanor. The tension that had hung over the street for nearly half an hour seemed to loosen slightly. The officer straightened his shoulders and stepped back from the porch. Yes, sir, he said again, more quietly this time. Marcus nodded politely. Thank you for coming to check on the neighborhood, officer. Hayes looked between the two of them once more, clearly aware that the moment had shifted in a way he had not anticipated when he first stepped out of his cruiser. The flashing lights continued their slow rotation across Maplewood Avenue as he took another step backward toward the walkway. What he had not realized earlier that evening was that the law he believed he was enforcing on that street was now standing directly in front of him.